Imagine a king so desperate for love, power, and an heir that he defied the Pope, changed the course of history, and sent two of his own wives to the executioner's block. This isn't a legend, it's the true story of King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, a tale of obsession, betrayal, and bloody consequences. But how did a single king go through 6 marriages, and why did so many of his queens meet such tragic ends? Let's uncover the dark secrets behind the most infamous marriages in history. In 16th century England, marriage wasn't just about love. It was a matter of politics, alliances, and producing a male heir. Henry VIII, desperate to secure the Tudor dynasty, married not once, not twice, but 6 times in pursuit of an heir and a queen who would satisfy his insatiable desires. But his impatience and paranoia led to a path of destruction, leaving behind betrayed wives, fatherless children, and a nation in turmoil. Let's meet the women who dared to marry England's most infamous king and paid the price. Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a woman of resilience, intellect, and unwavering faith. Born in 1485 as the daughter of Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, she was destined for greatness. From a young age, she was trained in statecraft, languages, and diplomacy, preparing her for the life of a queen. She was first married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, in 1501, but tragedy struck just months later when Arthur died, leaving Catherine a young widow in a foreign land. Determined to maintain the alliance between England and Spain, Catherine claimed that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, clearing the way for her eventual betrothal to Henry VIII. In 1509, after Henry ascended the throne, they were married, and Catherine became the Queen of England. For over 2 decades, she fulfilled her duties with grace, acting as regent when Henry was away at war and earning the love and respect of the English people. She was highly educated and fiercely devoted to her Catholic faith, shaping Henry's court with Spanish influence and religious piety. However, Catherine's inability to produce a male heir became an obsession for Henry. Though she gave birth to multiple children, only one survived, Princess Mary, later known as Mary I of England. Henry, desperate for a son, began to seek ways to end their marriage. He became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, who refused to become his mistress and insisted on marriage. Henry sought an annulment from the Pope, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had previously been married to his brother. Catherine, however, refused to concede. She adamantly insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that she was Henry's lawful wife. As the battle for the annulment raged on, Catherine was cast aside. She was forced to leave court and was separated from her daughter, Mary, whom she adored. The Pope's refusal to grant Henry's annulment led to a seismic shift in history, the English Reformation. Henry broke away from the Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn in secret. Catherine, stripped of her title as queen, was sent to live in increasingly harsh conditions at Kimbolton Castle. She spent her final years isolated, ill, and heartbroken. On January 7, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at the age of 50. Her final letter to Henry, written in her last days, addressed him as "my most dear lord and husband," showing her unwavering loyalty even in the face of betrayal. Some claimed she was poisoned, but most historians believe she succumbed to cancer. Her death marked the end of an era, but her daughter, Mary, would later ascend the throne and attempt to restore Catholicism to England. Catherine's legacy endures as a symbol of strength, dignity, and defiance against injustice. She was a queen who fought for her rights, her faith, and her daughter's future, even as the world turned against her. Her story is one of tragedy, endurance, and an unshakable will that shaped the course of English history. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was one of the most controversial and fascinating figures in English history. Her story is one of ambition, love, betrayal, and a shocking downfall that still captivates historians centuries later. Born around 1501, Anne was raised in the courtly traditions of England, the Netherlands, and France, making her highly educated, charming, and politically astute. Unlike Henry's previous wife, Catherine of Aragon, Anne was not a foreign princess, but came from a noble English family. Yet, she would rise higher than anyone could have imagined and fall just as dramatically. Anne first caught Henry's eye around 1525 while serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Unlike other women at court, she refused to become Henry's mistress, insisting on marriage instead. Her intelligence, wit, and confidence captivated Henry, and he became determined to make her his queen. However, there was one major obstacle: his marriage to Catherine. Henry spent years seeking an annulment, but the Pope refused, leading him to break away from the Catholic Church and establish the Church of England. In 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married, and she was crowned queen. Anne's rise to power was dazzling but precarious. She quickly became pregnant, but when she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, Henry's disappointment was evident. Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, and with each failed pregnancy, Henry's affection for her waned. Meanwhile, Anne had made powerful enemies at court. Her sharp tongue, political involvement, and reformist religious views alienated many, including Henry's most trusted advisors. By 1536, Anne's enemies saw an opportunity. She was arrested and charged with adultery, treason, and even incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Historians widely believe these charges were fabricated to remove her from power. After a highly publicized trial, Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by a skilled French swordsman, a rare act of mercy from Henry. Anne's death was swift, but her legacy endured. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most debated figures, a woman who defied expectations, rose to unimaginable heights, and paid the ultimate price for it. She was the queen who played the game differently and won. Jane Seymour, the woman who succeeded where others failed, the only wife Henry VIII ever truly mourned. But was she a devoted queen or a calculated survivor? Born around 1508, Jane came from an ambitious, noble family. Unlike the fiery Anne Boleyn before her, Jane was quiet, obedient, and demure, exactly what Henry VIII was craving. By 1535, she was serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne, silently watching as Anne's marriage fell apart. Anne had given Henry passion but no son, and Henry was growing impatient. Then, he noticed Jane. She was everything Anne was not: reserved, traditional, the perfect Tudor wife. Henry became obsessed. He pursued her relentlessly, even gifting her a locket with his own portrait, one she boldly opened and closed in front of Anne. The message was clear: Jane Seymour was Henry's next queen. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. The court was a viper's nest of betrayal, and Henry wasted no time. As Anne sat in the Tower of London, awaiting execution, Jane was already being prepared for her new role. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. The very next day, Henry was officially engaged to Jane Seymour. Less than 2 weeks later, they were married. No mourning, no hesitation, just a swift exchange of queens. But Jane knew her place. She never argued, never opposed Henry. She had seen what happened to those who did. Instead, she played the role perfectly: the obedient wife, the devoted queen. And on October 12, 1537, she delivered the ultimate prize, a son, Prince Edward VI. The Tudor heir Henry had spent decades waiting for. Finally, a male successor. But fate was cruel. 12 days later, Jane Seymour was dead. She had fallen gravely ill, likely from postpartum infection. Despite every effort, nothing could save her. Henry, the man who discarded wives like old garments, was devastated. Jane was given a queen's funeral, the only wife Henry ever honored this way. And in death, she achieved something no other wife could. She remained untarnished in Henry's memory. He would go on to marry 3 more times, but in the end, when he faced death, he chose to be buried beside Jane Seymour. But here's the real question: was Jane Seymour the perfect Tudor queen, or the ultimate strategist in a deadly game of power? By 1539, Henry VIII had already discarded 3 wives, 1 divorced, 1 executed, and 1 dead in childbirth. Now in his late 40s, overweight and increasingly paranoid, he was desperate for another queen. This time, he wasn't just looking for love, he needed a political alliance. The powerful German Duchy of Cleves was an ideal partner against Catholic France and Spain. Enter Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman raised with strict Lutheran values, modest, obedient, and completely unprepared for the ruthless world of the Tudor court. But there was a problem. Henry had never seen her in person. Instead, he relied on a portrait painted by the legendary artist Hans Holbein. The image showed a young, fair-skinned beauty, just what Henry wanted. Excited, he agreed to the marriage immediately. Then Anne arrived in England. The moment Henry laid eyes on her, he was horrified. She didn't look like the woman in the portrait. She wasn't seductive, flirtatious, or trained in the elegant ways of the English court. Worse, she barely spoke English and had no idea how to please a man like Henry. Furious, Henry called her a Flanders mare and refused to consummate the marriage. But it was too late, they were already wed. For 6 awkward months, Anne tried to be a good queen, but Henry wanted out. He claimed she repulsed him, even boasting to his courtiers that he couldn't bring himself to touch her. But unlike Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves was smart. She saw what happened to Henry's unwanted wives. She knew arguing meant death. So, when Henry demanded an annulment, she agreed immediately, and in return, she hit the jackpot. Henry rewarded her handsomely. He gave her castles, estates, a massive fortune, and the honorary title, the king's beloved sister. She even had the freedom to stay in England and live in luxury. Unlike Henry's other wives, she never suffered imprisonment, exile, or execution. She outlived Henry and all of his other queens, dying peacefully in 1557. So while Anne of Cleves lost a husband, she gained everything else. And in the end, she may have been the smartest wife of them all. She was young, beautiful, and full of life, but she was also reckless, naive, and doomed from the start. Catherine Howard wasn't just Henry VIII's 5th wife, she was his greatest obsession. By 1540, Henry was a bloated, aging, and increasingly bitter king. He had just escaped an unwanted marriage to Anne of Cleves, and when he first saw Catherine Howard, she was everything he had lost: youthful, flirtatious, and radiant. She was only around 17. He was nearly 50. To Henry, Catherine was his second chance at passion. He showered her with gifts, called her his rose without a thorn, and showed her off like a trophy. But what he didn't know was that Catherine had dark secrets, ones that would cost her everything. Before she became queen, Catherine had been raised in the household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. But the Duchess had little control over her. Catherine was left unsupervised and had secret love affairs. She was involved with Henry Manox, a music teacher, and later Francis Dereham, a courtier, who claimed they were pre-contracted to marry. When she married Henry, she thought she had left her past behind. But being queen didn't change who she was. As Henry's health worsened, he could no longer keep up with his young, energetic bride. Bored and trapped in a marriage to an old, sick king, Catherine made the biggest mistake of her life. She took a lover. Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's trusted courtiers, was young, charming, and dangerous. Catherine risked everything to be with him, sneaking through the palace at night for secret meetings. But secrets don't stay hidden in the Tudor court. Soon, whispers of Catherine's past reached Henry's advisors. The king's men tortured Francis Dereham, forcing him to confess everything. And worse, they discovered Culpeper's letters to Catherine. Henry VIII's passion turned to rage. He was humiliated, furious that his young wife had betrayed him. Catherine was dragged from her chambers, screaming. She was stripped of her title and locked away in a convent while Henry decided her fate. Dereham and Culpeper were executed first. Dereham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body chopped into pieces. Culpeper, favored by the king, was given a merciful beheading. But Catherine, she was next. On February 13, 1542, the teenage queen was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. She collapsed in terror, but was forced to stand. Before the axe fell, she whispered, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Moments later, she was beheaded with a single stroke. She was barely 19 years old. Catherine's reckless pursuit of love cost her her crown, her dignity, and her life. And Henry VIII, he moved on. By the time Catherine Parr became Henry VIII's 6th and final wife, the king was old, sick, and dangerously paranoid. His body was riddled with disease, his mind consumed by suspicion, and his track record with wives was nothing short of deadly. 5 had come before her, 2 had been beheaded, 1 had died in childbirth, 1 had been cast aside, and 1 had barely escaped with her life. Catherine knew exactly what she was walking into. But unlike the others, she was prepared. Born in 1512, Catherine had already been married twice before she caught Henry's eye. She was smart, level-headed, and deeply religious. She was no great beauty, but she had one thing Henry needed most: a caretaker. By 1543, Henry was morbidly obese, covered in sores, and barely able to walk. He needed a queen who could nurse him, manage the court, and keep him from spiraling into chaos. Catherine was perfect for the role. But what Henry didn't know was that she had a secret love. Before Henry proposed, Catherine had fallen in love with Thomas Seymour, the charming, ambitious brother of Henry's late wife, Jane Seymour. But when the most dangerous man in England asks for your hand in marriage, saying no is not an option. She reluctantly became Henry's sixth wife on July 12, 1543. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Catherine didn't rely on charm or beauty to survive. Instead, she used her intelligence and diplomacy. She was an advocate for religious reform, writing and publishing her own books, a rare feat for a Tudor queen, but her intellect nearly got her killed. Catherine was a devout Protestant in a time when religious tensions were deadly. She openly debated theology with Henry, challenging his views. But arguing with a king who had sent 2 wives to the chopping block? Dangerous. His advisors, eager to get rid of her, convinced Henry that Catherine was a heretic. An arrest warrant was drawn up. Guards were ordered to seize her. But Kever the strategist got wind of the plot. The night before her arrest, she threw herself at Henry's mercy, claiming she only debated with him to distract him from his pain. She flattered him, played the role of the dutiful wife, and convinced him that she was his most loyal subject. By the time the guards arrived to arrest her, Henry had changed his mind. Instead of ordering her execution, he embraced her in front of the entire court and declared his love and trust in her. Catherine had done what no one else could. She outmaneuvered the most dangerous man in England, and she lived. When Henry died in 1547, she finally got what she wanted, freedom. Within months, she secretly married Thomas Seymour. But happily ever after? Not quite. Thomas was unfaithful, reckless, and flirted with Catherine's stepdaughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. Catherine became pregnant for the first time at age 35, a dangerous age for childbirth in the 16th century. In 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, but soon after she fell gravely ill with childbed fever. Her final words, "My lord, I am not well. God help me." Days later, she was dead. Catherine Parr had escaped Henry VIII's wrath, only to fall victim to the one thing she never saw coming, motherhood. She was the only wife to outlive Henry, but fate still had the final say. Did Catherine Parr outsmart Henry, or was she just lucky? Let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to Execution Detective for more shocking historical tales.